instead of fighting to be the most important, what if you lived in a completely different way? You guys, in the last kingdom, the high places and the low places have traded places. You don't fight your way to power, you kneel your way there. We're going to take a look at some parables that explain to us what his kingdom is like. Give us a bigger, better vision, a revision of who he is and who we're created to be. And the one I want to kick it off with, I think, is a game changer for any of us who've ever felt like we wanted to get away from church because we just weren't sure we belonged. It's found in the book of Luke. By the time we hit this story, Jesus is pretty well known. He's made a name for himself. He's been traveling around, performing miracles, healing people, creating waves and ripples with the religious and political elites, and he ends up getting invited to a party at the house of a Pharisee, one of the most important and powerful religious leaders in Jerusalem in his day. And as Jesus shows up at this party, he watches as all the other guests are kind of like jockeying for position. They're trying to get the most important seat, trying to make sure that everyone knows that like they're better than all the other folks there, because like that's the way of our world, right? But Jesus sees it as an opportunity to teach something about what his kingdom, the last kingdom, is all about. And this is what we read in verse 7. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, give this person your seat. Then, humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place. And then you will be honored in the presence of all the other guests. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. All right, before we even get into the power of what Jesus is teaching here, I want to talk about the setting, because it's really interesting. And this setting is almost a paradigm for where Jesus almost always teaches us about what his kingdom is like. Like I studied politics and history in college. Long story, I was trying to be a lawyer. God and I did not have the same vision for my life. Here we are. He won. But like, when you study the kingdoms of this world, you look at thrones, rulers, laws, and armies. But when you study the kingdom of God, you got to look at the table. Because it's at the table, like hanging out with the kind of people that he hung out with, that Jesus most often teaches the deepest truths about his identity and his mission, about who he is and who he came for. It's also at the table where he's often his most rebellious, by inviting people in that no one else would invite in, as a clear way of communicating to the world around him that his kingdom does not function like their kingdoms. Jesus spent a lot of time at the table. I think in church we talk a lot about his teachings, and we talk a lot about his miracles, and we should. They're awesome, but we don't frequently talk about how much Jesus ate. We gloss over that part. But seriously, if you read the life stories of that dude, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, he never missed a meal. He was always grabbing dinner somewhere, which means you got to be careful if you're trying to follow in his footsteps. Because if you eat like Jesus, but you don't walk like Jesus, you're going to look like Buddha. That's science. All right, that's science. And so Jesus is at this dinner, and he watches everybody fighting to be the most important person there, and he looks at him and he says, don't do that. Don't do that. And now, never mind, he starts with this ridiculous premise that someday you might be somewhere where somebody is cooler than you. Like, I know that's probably never going to happen. You're like, okay, what a ridiculous hypothetical, Jesus. Like, but just in case it does, he has thoughts for you. And it's not just dinner etiquette, it's a blueprint of the kingdom. He says, instead of fighting to be the most important, what if you lived in a completely different way? But it's hard to do because we live in a world where everybody's fighting to be the most important. Our society is not that different than theirs was 2,000 years ago. We're obsessed with status. Who's better and who's worse and who matters and who doesn't and who's the greatest and who's less than the greatest and where do I fit in along that entire pecking order. And can we be honest for a minute? We hate that game. All of us hate it, but we play it anyway. Kids play it on the playground, teenagers play it on social media, adults play it at work. The church even gets caught up in it. This status game, and we play it because we don't know any other way. It's the only thing we've ever seen. But part of what Jesus is saying in Luke 14 is the reason your heart is unsettled about that whole thing is that you weren't made to play that game. You were made for a better world. You were made for this rebel last kingdom where those who exalt themselves are humble, but those who humble themselves are exalted. You guys, in the last kingdom, the high places and the low places have traded places. You don't fight your way to power, you kneel your way there. You don't sit on the top because of greatness. You stoop to serve. You don't demand attention, you give it away. Well, that's a radical, wild vision, but Jesus isn't even finished. In verse 12, he continues. He looks at the host and he says, hey, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your sisters or your relatives or your rich neighbors. If you do, they might invite you back and then you'll be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you'll be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. I mean, this is pretty presumptuous. Jesus is looking at this rich guy who's about to feed him dinner, and he's like, dude, you're doing it wrong. You have it completely backwards, because transactional relationships, where you do things for other people only because they have something to offer you in return, actually drain life out of you instead of breathing it into you. I got a whole better way. Meaning, beauty, and purpose are found when you give yourself away to those who have absolutely nothing to offer you in return. And that's just not party advice for Jesus. For him, that's a way of life. It's a description of his entire mission. He stepped out of eternity and gave himself away. He literally allowed himself to be brutally executed on a cross to pay the penalty for our sin. Because our sin earns death, but we couldn't pay it on our own. And so he died to pay a price we couldn't pay. And then he rose again and unlocked death from the inside on our behalf so that we could live. And he's saying that's where life is found. It's found in humbling yourself and giving yourself away. And he did that for us even though we could never pay him back.